Good evening, lover of dark stories. Did you come for the story? Or did the story come for you? If you're here, it's because you enjoy the kind of tales that linger in your mind, the ones that haunt you for days. And tonight, I have a story that will stay with you far longer than you imagine. You probably wouldn't believe it, but what I'm about to tell you is something many people in a small town in Pennsylvania wish they could forget. But stories like this aren't so easily erased. Now that you're here, I hope you're comfortable. Put on your headphones, light a candle, and pay close attention. I won't bother interrupting this tale with a bunch of ads. So, without further delay, let's begin. You probably wouldn't believe this, but trust me, everything I'm about to tell you is real. The story unfolding here is not a product of my imagination. It's a true story. I know this because I lived it. You'll understand Centralia ... a ghost town, abandoned by almost all its inhabitants due to an underground fire that never ceased. No regular human would pass through there. And don't ask me how a detective like me ended up there. But I did. Call me crazy, but at some point, my profession led me to this desolate town. When I was hired to investigate a series of disappearances in the area, it seemed like just another job, something simple to solve. Little did I know the answers would be far beyond what I expected. People were vanishing, and no one knew why. No one dared to speak of the rumors ... Those who ventured there and came back, well, they weren't exactly the same. Their stories? Insane. Something about a human organ trafficking ring, a dark mafia operating in the underworld of a ghost town where life no longer existed. I knew something was wrong. But what awaited me? Well, you probably won't believe. You know how it is when a story begins, and you think you know where it will end. But in the end, it's you who is being told the story. I wasn't prepared. Continuing the investigation led me to a cruel truth, a truth that made me question the very nature of humanity. I was face to face with something so insidious and disturbing that even my training hadn't prepared me for it. In that town, amidst the abandonment, I encountered something more macabre than anyone could imagine. Centralia, that village lost in time, had a secret that bled in the shadows, a secret that involved lives ... and deaths. I must tell you, my friend, this is not easy to swallow. What I'm about to tell you now, oh, you'll be afraid to look into the dark after this. The first clue came when I found the corpse of one of the victims. No, it wasn't a common body. There was something there that didn't fit the typical investigations I'd done before. What unsettled me the most wasn't the brutality of the scene, but the state of the body. It had been perfectly dismembered. But this wasn't just any killing. There was precision in the wounds, a methodology. Every part of the body had been removed with almost surgical care. Only one kind of person could do something like that ... A psychopath. And this, as I would soon discover, was just the tip of the iceberg. The place was immersed in a dense fog. The streets of Centralia seemed to be watching me, as if they were waiting for something. I felt invaded by something I couldn't explain. The city was alive in some way, but not in a way anyone could call healthy. I looked around, trying to absorb it all, and then a sense of despair overtook me. It was as if something was approaching. A gaze, but not the gaze of a man. No, something far more evil. The mist around me seemed to move, as if it were alive. Went to the local police station, and soon I was introduced to the sheriff, who looked at me with a cautious, distrustful stare. He knew something I didn't, something he refused to share. And then, the truth began to unfold before me, like a living nightmare, where each piece fell into place in a terrifying way. I discovered, after some investigation, that the town had become a hub for human organ trafficking. The victims were kidnapped, tortured, and then their organs removed with a chilling precision. It was a highly secretive operation, but very efficient. The person responsible for this barbarity? A man without a name, but known in the town for his brutality. The butcher. The sheriff, with a look of guilt in his eyes, told me that everyone in the town had some involvement in the trafficking, even if it was just through omission. As I dug deeper, the stories about the butcher left me even more perplexed. The victims were brought to the town, often lured by the promise of jobs or a better life. However, once they arrived, they were quickly disappeared. Their organs were removed so professionally that it seemed impossible for someone so ... sadistic to be capable of it. That night, I felt something far more horrible was about to happen. I was being watched. I knew it. I could feel it. The steps, almost invisible, in the empty streets of Centralia. Fear was beginning to take hold of me. But I had a job to do. What I didn't know was that soon, I would become the next victim. And there would be no escape. That night seemed to never end. I was at the police station, reviewing the files of the missing victims, but nothing made sense. The names repeated, the stories were vague, as if the records themselves were trying to hide the true extent of what was happening. My body was tense, alert, and a strange feeling crept into my mind, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. The sheriff was watching me from a distance, his eyes hiding something he didn't want to share. And it was that night, in the early hours, that he finally gave in. After much insistence, he led me to the place where the victims were taken. I, with a mix of fear and a need to understand, followed him without question. A labyrinth of dark, abandoned streets led me to a decaying house, where the atmosphere seemed to suffocate any trace of life. This is the point of origin. Here, they disappear for good, the sheriff whispered, as if afraid someone might overhear him. The house was surrounded by silence, a deadly silence, as if the place itself was waiting for something, or someone, to move. The walls were stained, and the smell of decay was strong in the air, mixed with something else, something more metallic. I could barely breathe. What had happened here? Why did no one dare to speak of it? We entered the house. The floor creaked. With each step, my hands were sweaty, but my mind was focused. I needed to find the truth. It was more than just a job, more than just an investigation. Something in me had changed, something that told me I was closer to understanding everything. And at the same time, closer to what I feared. We reached the basement. I could barely see anything, but soon I could feel the intense cold that emanated from the place. The sheriff guided me to a rusted door and opened it reluctantly. What I found inside made me tremble. There were several beds, some with sheets stained with dried blood, others empty, but still bearing the marks of pain. In the center of the room, an operating table was covered with instruments I never imagined I'd see in a town like that. Knives, scalpels, and other surgical tools, all meticulously arranged. It didn't look like a torture room. It didn't look like anything I knew. It looked like a professional's practice room, as if those responsible for it were doctors, but not human. That's when something on the wall caught my attention. A series of photos hung there, all showing what remained of the victims. Mutilated bodies, organs removed with a precision that bordered on the macabre. I could see in the eyes of the people in the photos a mix of pain and desperation. What was happening here was beyond human comprehension. It was something meant to be hidden, erased, as if the lives of these people didn't matter. I looked at the sheriff, and his face was pale, as if he was reliving the moments when he had to choose between his life and the truth. He stepped back, as if feeling a pressure on him. The man was broken, and I knew it. That town, that place, had devoured the morality of everyone who lived there. That's when the basement door slammed shut. The air grew thicker, and I felt a growing pressure on my shoulders. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. I was no longer alone down here. When I looked back, I saw the shadow. It was a silhouette, a presence that could not be ignored. The metallic smell intensified, and a low, almost imperceptible laugh echoed through the room. My muscles froze. The figure was standing still, just watching. It was him. The butcher. In a surge of impulse, I grabbed my gun and aimed at the figure. But before I could act, the door opened violently, and I was thrown against the wall. The pain invaded me, but the fear was even greater. I knew I was facing the purest form of evil. The psychopath who had been hired to carry out the horrors in that town was now standing before me. He spoke in a low voice, with a frightening calmness. "You don't understand. They think I'm just a monster. But I'm not. I'm the cure. I'm the solution." His voice was cold, almost whispered, but full of a macabre confidence. I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that my life was at risk. The adrenaline mixed with terror, but something inside me refused to give in. I couldn't let that monster escape. He knew that, and his eyes gleamed with a cold satisfaction. "You think you can stop me?" He laughed. "I'm already more than you can imagine. And when you disappear, others will come. There's no avoiding what's coming." I knew that if I didn't do something, death would be the only way out. So, suddenly, with a desperate effort, I pulled my gun and fired. But he was faster than I was. just a man. He was something beyond our comprehension. Before I could react, he stepped back, disappearing into the shadows, laughing softly. I was alone again, but not for long. The butcher continued to hunt, and Centralia was no longer just an abandoned town. It had become a den of horrors, where human life meant nothing. I didn't know who to trust anymore, but one thing was certain. He was still out there. The silence after the butcher's departure was almost more deafening than his presence. My body was trembling, but not from the cold. It was a feeling of despair. I knew I had heard enough, seen enough to understand that the game was lost. There was no more escaping. I was at the center of something much bigger than a simple missing persons investigation. What I saw in that basement, those photos, and those instruments, weren't just evidence of organized crime, but of something deeply sick, a cult of death, where human life was treated as disposable merchandise. The butcher was not just an isolated psychopath. He was the necessary accomplice for something much greater, something that devoured lives and left nothing but ashes. The body stretched on the operating table, the pieces of flesh and human organs, arranged like a trophy. It all pointed to something even more grotesque behind it all. He was just the tip of the iceberg, a piece that wasn't fully in place yet. I slowly got up from the floor, feeling every pain in my body, but something heavier in my chest, a weight that wouldn't go away. The city was alive, in a macabre way, waiting for its next victim, awaiting a new scream to feed its shadows. I ran for the entrance, but as I left the basement, I was immediately interrupted. The door, which had been open, was now locked. The cold that formed around me made my spine freeze. It was as if the house's walls had closed in, as if someone or something was watching me with every movement. The horror that had once seemed a mere possibility was now before me, real and tangible. That's when the light flickered, and a shadow passed by me. The sheriff was there, standing at the door, but it wasn't the sheriff I knew. His eyes were empty, as if life had been drained from him. He looked at me without saying a word, and it was then that I realized he was involved up to his neck, not just in the organ trafficking, but in protecting the butcher. He had brought me there so I could see it, so I could be part of it. And now ... he was ready to silence the only witness. "You shouldn't have come here," he said with a cold, emotionless voice. "Now you're part of the game, and no one, absolutely no one, leaves Centralia. Not anymore." I tried to react, to run, to do something, but fear was paralyzing me. The shadows, once distant, were now closing in around me, and I could no longer distinguish where the real world ended and the nightmare began. The sheriff took a step forward, and before I could make a move, something heavy was thrown against my head, knocking me out. I woke up in a dark place. The smell of mold and blood was in the air. When I opened my eyes, I was in a room even more sinister than the basement. There were more chairs, more chains, and more bodies scattered around. But the worst part was the feeling. I could feel the eyes watching every movement I made. That place had been made to be a center of suffering, a waiting room for death. In the corner, a figure was leaning against the wall, watching me with a grotesque smile. It was him, the butcher. The beast I already knew was more than just a man. His smile widened when he saw me wake up. "Welcome to my home," he said, as if offering me a place to stay. "Here, the pain is eternal. But you, my friend, you will learn. You will learn what it means to be part of all this." That smile was the last thing I wanted to see, but there was no escape. The butcher was not just anyone. He represented the darkest face of humanity, that part everyone tries to hide under the rug, until, one day, it emerges from the shadows to consume everything around it. And now, I was there, with death waiting for me, yet another victim, another discarded piece. The room seemed to close in around me. I was being consumed by the shadows, and pain began to become a constant, a presence in my body that I couldn't ignore. But then, what happened next was not something I could have predicted. The butcher moved closer, and before I could even react, he stopped and looked at me with a curious gaze. Something was different about him. It was as if he was waiting for something. He raised the knife, the blade shining in the dim light of the room. But instead of killing me right there, he pushed me into a chair, securing me in a position where I couldn't move. I was helpless. The pain, the fear, and the anger mixed inside me. But something else was happening. He wasn't just physically torturing me. He was trying to at that moment that I realized the true horror. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted me to become part of him, to be a piece in his macabre work. He wanted to transform me into something like him. The worst part was that, for a moment, I began to believe he was right. Maybe I was, in fact, part of the game. Maybe everything I knew was just a role in a much bigger story. And deep down, I knew I wouldn't get out of there. Not anymore. But before I could succumb to total despair, something strange happened. A distant sound, a gunshot, and the door to the room opened. The light from the street illuminated the room, and the figure of the butcher froze, looking toward the entrance. He hesitated, as if waiting for something. And then, finally, he turned back to me, with a smile wider than before. "You'll see, I always come back," he whispered. And before I could understand what was happening, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving me there, with the feeling that, perhaps, the worst was yet to come. I didn't know what was happening. The butcher, that monster, had just left me there, alone, in the darkness of that place. The door he left open seemed like an invitation to chaos. It didn't make sense. There was something in his expression, something in his smile, that told me he was still playing, that this wouldn't be the last time I'd encounter him. It was as if he was watching me from somewhere, a spectator who knew the game was far from over. The distant sound of the gunshot still echoed in my mind, but it seemed like an echo, a scream that was fading further away, leaving nothing but emptiness. Time seemed to have stopped, fear eating at me, and the pain in my body reminded me of the reality. But something was changing. I was starting to understand that this nightmare wasn't something that could be solved by a simple investigation. That town, Centralia, was a black hole where souls were consumed, where morality didn't exist, where the living became pawns in a dirty game, a farce run by invisible hands. I tried to move, but the pain was overwhelming. What the butcher had done to me and to all those other victims wasn't just physical. He was trying to tear something from inside each of us. Something deep, something that, once lost, could never be recovered. The anguish, the desperation, the pain. He was shaping his victims, not just with blades, but with psychological manipulation. He wanted to create a legion of shadows, broken people, who would become part of his work. I was trapped in that cycle, and I knew the only way out of that town was to destroy the evil once and for all. But the problem was I didn't know how to do that. The sheriff, the man who once seemed like an ordinary person, was now just another puppet in the butcher's hands. And the others? They were all involved in one way or another. But what scared me the most was knowing that, by finishing the investigation, I was being consumed by the town itself. Every piece of me was being sucked into a deep hole, and I no longer knew what was real. The door was open, but I didn't want to go outside. I knew what awaited me. There was no easy way out anymore. The sheriff might have disappeared, but he hadn't forgotten about me. No one had forgotten me. I could run, but the whole town was against me. I looked around. The pale and empty faces of the victims in the photos still haunted my mind. They had looked at me with eyes that knew they were about to die. And that, I realized, was what I was now. One of those shadows, a victim of the same death network. I got up slowly, trying to push away the panic that was overtaking me. There was a sense of urgency, as if something or someone was hunting me. I looked down the hallway and saw a faint light. I moved toward it slowly, feeling the weight of each step. The wooden stairs creaked under my feet, and I knew that, at any moment, something could move in the shadows. I was no longer alone at that moment. A laugh echoed through the house, low and guttural, almost like a whisper. It came from all directions, from every wall. I knew the butcher was still there. He was waiting. He knew I had no more choices, but something inside me refused to be a victim anymore. Something ignited within me. I would not be another lost soul. I would not be another piece he could tear away. I had a chance. Perhaps it was the last one. The light I saw at the end of the hallway was a door. An exit. A crack in what seemed like an endless nightmare. I approached it, but then I heard the sound of something metal hitting the ground. I turned, and there he was. The butcher, standing at the end of the hallway, smiling at me with that insane grin. He was moving closer, and I could feel the smell of death in the air. "Do you think you can escape?" he said, with a calmness that sent chills through my bones. "There's nowhere to go. You're already part of my game, and I am the master of this game." I didn't know what to do, but something inside me refused to accept that this was my reality. I didn't know how, but I knew I had to fight. The butcher was coming toward me, closer with every passing second. I could hear the sound of his footsteps, the weight of death. Approaching Dot then, in a desperate move, I ran for the door. I knew it was my only chance. The door creaked open, and I threw myself outside, landing on the cold dirt floor. What I saw in front of me wasn't an open field, as I had expected. It was a desolate street, a street that led to nowhere. Centralia was there, like a prison, like a labyrinth of ruins and shadows. I was lost, not knowing where to run. The streets, once familiar, now seemed alien, as if I were in a place where the laws of time and space no longer applied. But I couldn't stop. The butcher was still behind me, and the shadows of the city, those same shadows that had been watching me, were closing in around me. But I ran without knowing where to go, without knowing if all of this was real, or if I was dreaming, if I was dying in that moment. I was being hunted, and the only thing I knew was that there was no turning back. The door to my reality had been shut forever. I no longer knew what was real. The heavy air of the town, the feeling of being constantly watched, the presence of the butcher, following me ... Everything was blending into an endless spiral of terror that seemed to have no end. The streets of Centralia, once deserted, now seemed alive, as if they were rearranging themselves, changing shape, creating new traps to keep me trapped. Every corner turned into a nightmare, and I didn't know where to run ... as I ran through the crumbling streets. The sounds of my own labored breaths mixed with the distant echo of the butcher's footsteps. He was behind me. I knew that. The sound of his heavy, rhythmic steps was catching up to me. Fear consumed me from the inside, but something else was emerging, something darker, a sense of inevitability. I wouldn't escape. I knew that now. I was only delaying the inevitable, what was destined to happen. I ran toward what seemed like an old church, its crumbling walls and the cross at the top of the tower bent, as if it were ashamed of existing there. The door was slightly open, and without hesitation, I entered. Inside, the silence was suffocating. The smell of mold and decay filled my nostrils, but there was no time to think. I needed to hide, even though I knew it would only be a matter of time before he found me. But what I found inside was much more than a temporary refuge. The church was full of remains, human remains, carcasses piled up, as if the place were a macabre storage. It was as if the butcher had taken pleasure in turning the church into a monument to pain. Every piece of flesh, every broken bone, seemed to have been used for some kind of sinister ritual. The feeling that I was in a profane place was palpable, a malignant presence that dominated the environment. I slowly backed away from the piles of bones, trying not to make a sound. My hands were shaking. What had this town done to the people? How was it possible that something so monstrous was happening, with no one able to stop it? Suddenly, the sound of my steps echoed through the empty walls of the church. Fear gripped me even harder, and the only thing I could do was look around, desperate. One had to get out of there. The butcher was near. I could feel his presence, the weight of the evil that followed him. What was he doing to me? What did he want from me? I ran toward the altar, with a faint light coming through the broken windows illuminated in the image of Christ, arms outstretched as if waiting for a prayer. That would never come. I crouched behind the altar, trying to hide in the shadows, praying for time to stop, for the nightmare surrounding me to be just a figment of my mind. But I knew it wasn't that way. I knew I was living the purest form of hell. Then the sound of footsteps grew louder. He was close, very close. I could no longer hide. I had no strength left to run. The butcher entered the church, walking calmly, as if enjoying my distress. His eyes were fixed on me, as if he already knew what he would do next. That insane smile on his face, that cold stare, he was waiting for something. "Do you think you can escape from me?" he said, his voice soft, almost seductive. "Do you think you're different? Do you think you can escape?" I didn't know how to answer. There was nothing I could say. He had already won. But at the same time, a part of me refused to accept that. I wouldn't be another victim. I wouldn't allow him to take me. The town, the darkness, the butcher. They were trying to break me, but I was still whole, still breathing, still fighting. I looked at the cross on the altar, and without thinking, grabbed a piece of wood that was nearby. It was all I had. It wouldn't be enough, but I had no choice. He was coming toward me, slow, confident steps. step he took seemed to bring him closer to the abyss. I knew this was my last chance. He came closer. "I always come back," he said, as if it were a simple truth. "I always come back because you can never get rid of me." And then, in the final moment of lucidity, I threw myself forward with all the strength I had left, creating distance between us. The wood I was holding struck his hand, making him drop the knife he was holding. But he didn't back off. No, he just smiled. "You still don't understand, do you? You're mine now. Every breath you take, every thought you have, every move you make. I control that." I was lost, but not without a fight. His words started to mix with the sound of my own breath, and everything around me seemed to disintegrate. The church, the town, the butcher, everything seemed to dissolve into an endless nightmare. But then, the impossible happened. Something intervened. A light. A presence that came from outside the church, lighting the place with an intensity that burned my eyes. The butcher froze. Something he hadn't expected. A force that made him hesitate, as if he weren't invincible. He looked back, confused, and in that moment, a scream. No, a roar ... echoed through the town. It was something primal, something not human. And before I could understand, the figure the butcher feared appeared in the shadows, and he quickly retreated, without looking back. I didn't know if I was saved, or if what was happening was a new form of nightmare. But something had changed. The butcher had lost control, and for some reason, I was still alive. I looked around, trying to understand, but the darkness of the town gave me no answers. And then, a single truth formed in my mind. I had been marked. The butcher wouldn't stop. And worst of all, ... he knew where I was. Where I would always be. I no longer knew what was real. The heavy air of the town, the feeling of being constantly watched, the presence of the butcher following me ... Everything was blending into an endless spiral of terror that seemed to have no end. The streets of Centralia, once deserted, now seemed alive in a distorted way. The crumbling houses rose like monuments to death, the streets stretching and contorting as if they had a will of their own, always changing, always adapting to what I feared most. I knew that no matter what happened, I was still trapped here. There was no turning back. Every step I took me deeper into the darkness, and the town seemed to swallow me whole. I found myself standing in the middle of an empty street, with nothing but the sound of the wind breaking the silence. Fear wouldn't leave me, but somehow, my mind felt clearer, more focused. I was beginning to understand what this place really meant. The town Centralia was no longer just a hole on the map. It was a portal, a prison for lost souls, a zone where death and life intertwined in an unsustainable way. The feeling of being in a nightmare, of being a piece of a much larger game, was becoming more and more real. I took another step, but as I did, I heard a low sound, almost imperceptible, behind me. It was the sound of something human, but not human. I didn't need to turn around to know. The butcher was there. He would always be there. He was part of Centralia now. And somehow, so was I. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest, and in front of me, I saw the distorted figure of the butcher. His eyes gleamed with that insane light, a flame that had no origin. He stood there, motionless, but somehow, his presence felt overwhelming, as if he were the town itself. The metallic smell of blood, mixed with the stench of death, filled my nostrils. "Do you really think you can escape from me?" His voice was cold, distant, as if it came from a deep abyss. "I am part of you now. I'm the nightmare you will never wake up from." I tried to run to escape, but my legs didn't respond. Every movement I made felt in slow motion. The feeling of being trapped, of no longer having control over my body, made me understand the gravity of the situation. He was no longer a man. The butcher had transformed into an entity, something beyond flesh, beyond pain. He was a force, a presence that transcended the boundaries of space and time. All I could think about was one thing. The town was no longer just a prison for bodies. It was a prison for minds. Every victim who fell here became part of an invisible web, a web woven with pain and fear. The feeling of being watched would never go away. Neither the butcher, nor the town, nor even the shadows could be ignored. He took a step toward me, and the sight of his insane smile almost made me lose my senses. He didn't need to say anything. His gaze already said it all. He wasn't me, and he was just the beginning. I, like all the other victims before me, was now a part of his work. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted to break me, to transform me, to make me a reflection of him. I saw what he wanted to do. He wanted to make me see the world the way he saw it, without value, without hope, with no escape. But something inside me refused to give in. I knew he was right about one thing. I was already part of him, but not in the way he imagined. I still had my mind. I still had my will. And deep down, I knew that if I didn't stop, he would end up consuming me. But what he didn't know was that, while he thought he was the predator, I had also become something else. He saw me as prey, but in those shadows, he forgot something fundamental. He was never invincible. I could fight Two Dot as he came closer. I felt the pain begin to invade me, but I also felt something else. Something strange, something distant, but still real. I wasn't alone. Even within that nightmare, there was something still resisting. The force that had emerged within me was greater than any fear or pain. It was the same force that the previous victims may have lost, but for some reason, I still had. With a cry of desperation, I lunged toward him. He was surprised for a moment, as if he hadn't expected someone to have the courage to react. But before I could strike him, he vanished, like a shadow dissolving into the darkness. I found myself back in the street, alone again. But the weight of what had happened was still with me. He wasn't dead. The butcher was like the town itself. He would never disappear. Not until everything had been consumed. The fear, the anguish, and the despair were still with me. But at least I knew one thing. The battle wasn't over. I didn't know what else Centralia had in store for me. But one thing was certain. I couldn't escape. I was trapped in that nightmare forever, fighting for my soul, knowing that deep down, there was no way to escape what the town does to people. And the butcher, well, he was always lurking, waiting for the right moment to show himself. Again, I was exhausted. My body, already marked by the wounds of fear and pain, betrayed me. Every step seemed to sink me further into the darkness of that cursed town. Centralia was no longer just an abandoned city, a place of ruins. No, it had become a prison. A prison for souls, a labyrinth of despair, and I was trapped in its center. The streets, once empty, now seemed alive, pulsing with a sickly energy. The houses, the buildings, everything seemed to breathe and move according to the will of the town itself. I was just a piece in its web, a piece that somehow was starting to understand how everything worked out. The feeling of being pursued never left my chills. The butcher, the figure that once seemed so human, now became a shadow that stretched over everything. I didn't know what he was anymore, if there was any trace of humanity left in him, but that didn't matter. He was an entity, a force that manipulated the town, as if everything that was happening, there was part of a bigger plan, a plan I couldn't comprehend. The smell of death, blood, and decay followed me like an invisible shadow, and there was nowhere to hide. I walked aimlessly through the deserted streets, trying to find some way out, but all the streets seemed to close in on me. I was going in circles, and with every corner, the city seemed denser, more oppressive. The air was heavy, as if the atmosphere itself had been impregnated with suffering. Every broken window, every fallen door, all reflected a world that was slowly dying. The city was on the brink of extinction, but not in the way I imagined. It wasn't dying. It was alive, breathing through fear and suffering. The sound of something breaking in the distance made my heart race. I turned quickly, but saw nothing. Only emptiness. The city was preparing to swallow me whole. But before I could react, I heard the laugh. Low, guttural, like an echo from beyond. It came from all directions. The butcher was there, watching me, as always. But this time, he wasn't just hunting me. No, he was waiting for me. He wanted me to be part of him, to become just another lost soul in that cursed town. I stopped in the middle of the street, breathing heavily. I knew my fight wasn't just against him, but against everything Centralia represented. The town was an entity in itself, something I couldn't defeat with violence or force. The only way to escape was to understand. To understand what the town wanted from me. To understand what the butcher represented. To understand how everything connected. The key to getting out of there was in my mind, not in the physical world. Do you really think you can escape? His voice cut through the silence of the night, coming from somewhere, from every direction. I am your fate now. I am the pain you will carry to the end. I tried to block out the sound, tried to push his voice away, but it was inside me, as if he had infiltrated every thought. board, and the butcher wasn't the player. He was the force that controlled everything. And that's when I realized he wasn't just a killer. He was a representation of evil, and manifestation of all the shadows of humanity. He existed because the people in Centralia had allowed themselves to be corrupted, had given in to fear, pain, and suffering. The butcher didn't create fear. He fed on it. He lived off our pain, our helplessness. I took a step forward, feeling the weight of fear tighten around my lungs. The butcher was getting closer, but this time, I didn't back down. I knew what I had to do. If I wanted to survive, I would have to confront him head-on, understand the truth behind his existence. I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't hide in the shadows of the town. I needed to stop being a victim. He appeared in front of me once again. He was smiling, but there was no joy in his smile. He was challenging me, waiting for me to give in, waiting for me to succumb to the fear he represented. You think you can stop me? You think you can challenge what I am? He laughed, the laugh full of contempt. You're just another victim, like all the others. You'll become part of me. You'll become a reflection of what this town is. I looked at him, no longer with fear, but with anger. He wanted to turn me into yet another one of his shadows. But I wouldn't allow that. I wouldn't become part of what he represented. I wouldn't be another disposable piece of meat. You don't understand, I said, my voice trembling with determination. I'm already part of this town, but I'm not you. I'm not pain. I'm not death. And you'll see that. It was then that everything changed. The butcher froze. His expression distorted with confusion, as if he didn't know what to do with what I had just said. The city, that city of shadows, seemed to writhe, as if reacting to my resistance. And then, somehow, I knew he no longer had control. I was no longer being hunted. I was finally in control. But even so, I knew I wasn't free. The butcher wouldn't be defeated so easily. He was in me, and the city would never stop being part of me. I only knew one thing now. The fight would never end. But I was still alive. And that, for some reason, was all I needed to keep going. I began to walk, aimlessly, without direction, but now with a single truth guiding me. Evil never dies in Centralia. It only hides, waiting for the right moment to return. And the butcher, well, he was still out there. The city seemed to be dissolving around me. With every step, the streets of Centralia transformed, distorting as if trying to swallow me. I was trapped in an endless cycle, as if being pulled by forces I couldn't comprehend. But somewhere, inside me, a spark of resistance still burned. I had understood something that had previously eluded me. I was no longer a victim, no longer a spectator of suffering and pain. I was starting to understand that, in order to escape, I would need to do something that could not be explained, something beyond reason. I walked through the town, but the shadows stretching from the ruins of the houses seemed to follow me, watching me. The broken windows, the fallen doors, the moldy, twisted walls, everything seemed to move closer to me in a sinister way. I felt the weight of the town on my shoulders, as if it had become part of me, something that could no longer be separated from who I was. Fear, pain, and loss had now merged with my very existence. The sound of footsteps, distant but audible, made me stop. I didn't need to look to know who it was. The butcher was back. He had never left. He was the town, and the town was him. I could feel his presence approaching, like a shadow that devoured me slowly. Every part of me knew the fight wouldn't end. I could fight as much as I wanted, but he would always return. He was the eternal nightmare of Centralia. Do you really think you can free yourself? His voice sliced through the air, soft and venomous. You can't escape what you are. You can't escape what I am. I closed my eyes for a moment. He wanted to break me, wanted to make me believe there was no escape, that suffering was inevitable. But I knew now that he only had the power I gave him. He could only control me if I allowed myself to be controlled. I wasn't afraid anymore. I knew I had the power to change this. I didn't know how, but I knew that if there was a way out, it was within me. The town, the butcher, everything surrounding me was just a projection of my own fear, my own pain. I was what the town wanted me to be. I was the reflection of its shadows. But now, I had something I hadn't before, clarity. I'm not you, I said firmly. I won't get lost here. The butcher's voice grew louder, more threatening, but also more distant, as if he didn't know how to handle the fact that, for the first time, I was resisting his lose control. The town began to tremble, as if it was writhing in response to my strength. I didn't know what this meant, but I knew I was doing something right. I was breaking the curse of Centralia. Somehow, suddenly, an explosion of light shone on the horizon. I looked up at the sky and saw a sort of aurora, something supernatural, lighting the sky in an unsettling way. The shadows around me began to dissipate, and the weight of the town began to lift. The butcher's presence, which had seemed to be everywhere, was now wavering, uncertain. He was still there, but his influence was starting to fail. The city was disintegrating around me, and I could feel it. I didn't know if this was a dream, or if reality was finally giving way. The light burned intensely, and the shadows retreated. I didn't know where I was going, but something told me I was finally close to an answer. The town, that nightmare, was starting to pull away from me, and I felt a strange relief, as if something inside me was being set free. And, somewhere deep in my mind, I knew the butcher hadn't finished. He was just preparing for something even more terrible. He would always return, because he was the shadow of what the town represented. Evil never leaves Centralia. It only transforms. But for now, I had won a battle, and that, however small, gave me hope. I looked at the town, or what was left of it, and saw the ruins collapsing around me. But there was something more now. What had once been a prison was dissolving. I felt like I was being freed, as if the truth I had been seeking was finally within my reach. The town was collapsing, the shadows receding, and I knew that, once again, life had won, even if only for a short time. But, as I walked, a question still hammered in my mind. Would I ever really be free from Centralia? Or was this just the beginning of a greater war? A war against something I couldn't fully understand? I looked back one last time, and in the distance, I saw the figure of the butcher. He was still there, watching me, but something was different. He no longer seemed the same. He was weakened, and for a moment, he seemed to disappear into the shadows, as if the town itself had abandoned him. And then, as if knowing my struggle was just beginning, I moved forward, without looking back. I didn't know what would come next, but one thing was certain. No matter how many times the butcher or the town returned, I would never be the same. The battle had only just begun, but now I was prepared. And with that, something inside me told me Centralia would never have me again. The wind, though light, whispered through the ruins of the city. The sound of stones breaking and structures collapsing was the only sound that filled the air. The city was falling apart before my eyes, but not in a peaceful way. It was as if Centralia was shattering with one last scream, as if it knew that, by seeing me escape, it was losing something it would never recover. Every step I took in the ruined streets made me feel that what was behind me would never truly disappear. Even as the city disintegrated, I knew the butcher wasn't far away. He was there, always. He was the shadow that never left. But something inside me, something deep, told me that this wouldn't be the last time I'd face him. He still had a role to play. He still had something he wanted from me, not the dawn that had illuminated the horizon disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. But for some reason, I was no longer so worried about the darkness that began to spread again. There was something inside me, something that had changed, telling me I was no longer alone in this fight. The city seemed to have pulled away from me, but something else still connected me to it. The feeling that I could never fully escape, that the curse of Centralia would always return. That was still with me. The sun finally set behind the mountains, plunging the city into deep darkness. Yet even so, I didn't feel the weight of oppression anymore. Something inside me had lit up, and the idea of fleeing the city now seemed like an illusion. I knew Centralia wasn't trying to keep me prisoner physically. No, it wanted to devour me in another way. It wanted to consume my soul, my essence, and transform me into what it always was. A city of the undead, a prison for those who lose themselves in its shadows. As I walked down the road that stretched beyond the city's borders, I began to notice there were more people like me, lost, wandering through the shadows, like wandering souls. I saw them from a distance, their dark figures, but what disturbed me the most was that they were approaching me. They were the survivors, the ones who had resisted the city's temptation, those who somehow had been left behind, directionless. I watched them for a moment, feeling a connection with them, as if something invisible united them to me. They had no defined faces, only shadowy figures who seemed to carry the weight of the city on their shoulders. something familiar in their movements, the way they walked with a silent anguish, as if they were trapped between what was real and what wasn't. A man, further ahead, looked directly at me, his eyes empty, as if nothing else mattered. He approached slowly, and his voice, hoarse and broken, could be heard. "You don't understand, do you? Centralia never dies. You can escape, you can run, but it will follow you. It will always return." I didn't know how to respond. The truth in the man's words cut into my soul in a way I wasn't prepared to face. It was as if he knew something I still couldn't comprehend. I had won a battle, but the war, I now realized, was much bigger. Centralia wasn't just a lost town. It was a state of mind, an idea. And like all ideas, it never dies. It only transforms. I looked at the man one more time. He seemed worn down by the struggle, as if he had lost something important. And maybe he had. Maybe all of us were losing parts of ourselves, without realizing it. I didn't know how, but that city had taken something from me. Something that would never be recovered. The light of the stars began to shine brighter. The shadows were dissipating, but the feeling of being trapped in something larger, something deeper, never faded. I knew the butcher was still out there, waiting for the right moment. He would always be there, as part of the fabric of Centralia, a city that could never be forgotten. "You'll see," the man said, his voice low and trembling. "The city won't leave you in peace. It will always come back, and when it does, you'll be closer than you think to becoming like it." He turned and began to walk, his footsteps disappearing into the darkness. I wanted to say something, to ask how he knew this, but the words stuck in my throat. What he said was the truth, no matter how much I tried to deny it. I was already part of Centralia. Maybe in a way I still didn't fully understand, but I was connected to it now, and that connection was deeper than I could ever imagine. I continued my journey, the darkness closing in around me once again. The city was physically pulling away, but I knew that, in reality, it would never let me go. It had marked me, and somehow I was destined to return, to come back to its cold embrace. With every step I took, I wondered, would this be the end of my journey, or just the beginning of something even more macabre? I didn't know. But one thing was certain. Centralia would never let me go. The butcher would never let me go. And no matter how much I tried, I knew I would never be the same. The darkness surrounding me intensified as I walked, but paradoxically, there was something clearer in my mind. Something that had previously eluded me, but now seemed perfectly evident. I was trapped, and not just in the city. I was trapped in a reality where terror, pain, and suffering intertwined with the very essence of existence. And even now, with the remains of Centralia crumbling around me, I knew that the city had no intention of letting me go. It didn't need to imprison me physically anymore. I was already part of it. Something within me, something deeply rooted, had already become an extension of what it represented. The butcher was merely the grotesque reflection of that truth. He was the manifestation of what the city wanted to do to all who arrived there. Consume, break, and in the end, leave a part of them behind, marked an irreparable dot as I walked through. The ruins, the deserted streets gave me a strange sensation, as if something beyond the butcher was watching me. It was the city itself, keeping watch, as if it knew that, in some way, I still belonged to it. The cold mist that began to rise from the cracks in the asphalt seemed to move with a life of its own, twisting around my feet, making me feel even more trapped. I knew that the things I couldn't see were as real as the things I could, and that Centralia was alive, in a deeper and more terrifying way than any human could imagine. Each step seemed to move me farther from the memory of the city, but at the same time, it brought me closer to the reality that now defined it. I was lost, but not in the physical sense. Not anymore. I was lost in a much darker way, one that involved something beyond simple death. It didn't matter where I went, or how hard I tried to escape. A part of me would remain there, within the confines of Centralia. Perhaps that was the true curse. Stopped at the edge of a deserted road, observing what remained of Centralia. The city lights, once extinguished, were now faint, flickering as if the city was trying to reconnect with something that had been lost. The shadows were no longer just distorted figures, but shapes that seemed alive. Something lurking, waiting. Waiting for more victims? Or waiting for something else? Something I couldn't fully comprehend. What, in fact, was Centralia? Was it just a city? A curse? Or something more? I crouched at the edge of the road, my mind swirling around these questions, trying to understand understand what had happened to me. The vision of the butcher was still fresh in my mind, but unlike the absolute fear he once caused, now I felt a acceptance. I didn't know if he was still out there, if he was still hunting me, but I knew he represented something much bigger. He wasn't the only evil in Centralia. He was just one of its many faces. The real question was, what did the city want from me? As I tried to understand that, the cold breeze passed over me, and something in the wind seemed to call me, as if I had been summoned to a fate I couldn't escape. I stood up, unsure of what to do next, but something told me that I shouldn't be searching for answers outside of myself anymore. I knew that, somewhere inside me, I held the keys to understanding what was happening. Maybe, if I surrendered to the city, if I accepted what it was, I would finally understand. But at the same time, something inside me rebelled against this idea. How could I accept being consumed by something so monstrous? The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, interrupting my thoughts. I turned, and the figure of the butcher appeared in front of me. A giant shadow, faceless, yet with that unmistakable presence. He wasn't chasing me anymore, but approaching with a disturbing calmness, as if he wanted to show me something. His smile, that horrific smile, slowly formed on his face, and his eyes gleamed with a light that seemed to pierce my soul. "You've realized it, haven't you?" he said, his voice macabre and full of a disturbing tranquility. "You will never escape from me. You will never escape from Centralia. You are already part of it. You are already with me." His words were not threatening, but affirming, as if he were revealing an inevitable truth. The fear I was supposed to feel no longer existed. There was no more dread or disgust, only a deep emptiness, an understanding that I would never be able to free myself. Centralia and the butcher were no longer external threats. They were now part of me, and this idea froze me to the bone. "I am the reflection of everything you feel, everything you fear," he continued. "The city is no longer a place. It is an extension of you, of all of us who came here and never left. And when you finally understand this, when you accept what you've become, you will realize that the fight never ends." I looked at him, the pain deep in my eyes, and I understood. He was right. I couldn't escape. I didn't want to escape. I was part of the city now, part of everything it represented. And as the butcher watched, a part of me knew he would always be there, watching me, waiting. But he wouldn't be the only one. I was also trapped in the city's web, and no matter how hard I tried to fight, the city would not let me go. Centralia would never die, and in the end, I would understand that my story would not be one of escape, but of transformation. The city was not just a place where evil existed. It was the reflection of something much deeper, something inside me. Inside all of us. I gave my final glance at the butcher, and as he disappeared into the shadows, I understood. In the end, he wasn't the greatest enemy. The greatest enemy was what Centralia represented in each of us. I was no longer just wandering through the streets. I was becoming part of the story of Centralia. And now, it would be my story as well. In the end, there is only one certainty. The world we see may not be all that exists. Comment what you think. And if you have the courage, come back here tomorrow. There is always a new story waiting for you. But remember, some stories never end.